Hi, everyone. I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, theater, and entertainment. And today we're joined by the wonderful Kevin J. Hynes, who started life as a prosecutor, as a defender within the legal service, has ended up as a writer and a co-executive producer on shows like HBO's Perry Mason, USA's Dirty John, and is currently in the foray as a podcaster now with his latest effort, which is Healed, The Curious Case of Marla Trump's Shoes. And I was so fascinated by the premise of this. And it's so wonderful, given that this was actually a case that you were prosecuting and you were trying, and wanted to ask kind of like, what was the genesis of the point where you decided to turn this into a podcast series and were interested in that medium and that specific format for telling the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm obviously a true crime junkie because I grew up in true crime. As my father was a prosecutor growing up, so I grew up in the whole world of prosecution and criminal defense, criminal justice system. And when I came out here, I wrote on a lot of shows that have to do with crime, obviously. But I'm also someone who's always listening to these true crime podcasts. And I'm fascinated by them. I love them. When I have long commutes here in LA, I just turn them on and the minutes just flow by. So, but what I found was I was starting to get kind of depressed because they're so dark sometimes, and they deal with such really heavy subjects, murder and mysterious disappearances or just terrible, terrible stuff. And so I was always thinking, I should probably just listen to lighter podcasts. And I looked around to see if there was, because true crime is my love, are there true crime podcasts that are lighter? And there really wasn't much to choose from. So my co-host Trisha LaFoch, her and I have been friends for a long time. She's a lawyer and also an actor and director out here. I had told her, as I had told many people, about the Chuck Jones case, the Shoe Bandit who stole Marla Maples Trump shoes. And she's the one who suggested we should do a podcast about that. And then the two things clicked, like her desire to do that and my desire to find something that was fun and unable to find it. And so we decided, okay, let's do that. Let's do a podcast. The problem was that I had never done a podcast. Trisha had never done a podcast. And we were lucky enough to have young friends of ours who said, we'll try to figure it out. We'll produce it with you. And so we found a couple people who actually I worked on a TV show, Dirty John season 2 with. They worked on set with me when we were producing, and two young people, and they said, we'll figure it out. And so they all got together and figured out how to produce a podcast. And we, in 10 weeks, were able to write, produce, edit, and put up there the podcast Healed, The Curious Case of Marla Trump Shoes.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about the correlation between your experience as a writer and a co-EP on Dirty John, and kind of specifically how that lent itself to this, not just in terms of how you thought about the way that this could be a form of storytelling for this particular piece, but also in terms of, I know that you've mentioned how the experience of that and seeing the way in which with podcasts, you get to keep the proprietary rights. Nobody else owns the rights to this. This is fully your copyrighted property, but also there are still possibilities to expand upon it and move it into other mediums along the way. So I was interested if that was a deciding factor in the medium choice as well.
Yes, it was. And in fact, Dirty John season 1 was based on an LA Times podcast. And so that was my first foray into turning podcasts into television shows. And I was a co-EP on that show. Alexandra Cunningham was my mentor in the business. She created that show. So I had firsthand knowledge of how to do that. And when I was talking to both Trisha and the producers, I learned that, we had gone out to TV studios to sell it as a limited series first. And then decided, well, why don't we just create the IP ourselves, and therefore we will own the IP just the same way that the LA Times owned the IP for Dirty John, and then we can exploit that if we decided we wanted to make it into a television series, a limited series. And it was a business decision on my side, right? Which was, well, yeah, we can sell the rights to the TV show before the podcast, but I always saw it as a podcast because I had told the story so many times out here in LA and always got a positive response, people just laughing. So I thought to myself, I want to tell the story the same way. I want it to be a conversation between Trisha and myself about what happened and how bizarre it was and how many twists and turns it took and how it affected my life personally. But at the same time, be in a situation where I had nobody telling me how to do it. We did it ourselves, and we creative control, 100% creative control. You never get that in this business. And so I had that for this project. And now I think we have a really interesting podcast, which has some buzz. And, now we can take it up to TV studios and say, here it is, and I've now controlled all of the IP and also the creative content. So I'm able to, make the series myself, hopefully. So we'll see.
Yeah. In terms of the content and revisiting the case, I was really interested in what that looked like from your perspective and your journey throughout the process, because this was a case that you worked on, that you knew the details of intricately, but at the same time, it happened in the 90s, so it was a while ago. You mentioned that this is still kind of something that you get asked about frequently, so there are details that you've jumped into. Was there any kind of journey of like revisiting some of the materials, like any sort of research that you wanted to redo just to refamiliarize yourself with it?
Yeah, I mean, we had one of our producers was an expert in researching, and so he was able to actually go down to the New York Public Library and get some stuff off of microfiche, because a lot of the articles were not readily available. It felt like someone had really gone in and scrubbed the internet of some of this stuff, because I do remember reading articles at the time, which no longer exist, but we were fortunate enough to have a researcher pull some of that stuff. And yes, in fact, I did prepare a lot each episode by reading all the articles again and trying to get back in the time machine and go back and try to remember how I felt at the time, because I think that's part of it, right? How it affected me personally and professionally. And I think reading those articles and reading the stuff that was reported on back then helped me get in that mindset. And I was able to then kind of remember those, gut feelings when the twists and turns were happening, and how it felt like I was watching my career go down the tubes on a crazy case that has to do with shoes, right? So it was definitely a process of doing a lot of research, and also doing a lot of writing and rewriting, because all writing is rewriting, and preparing for the podcast, and then being able to tell the story in a narrative way that feels like you're kind of stooled up next to Kevin and Trisha in a bar, and Kevin's telling the story and Trisha's asking him questions because she knows about the case, but she's also very smart when it comes to leading me around the podcast, I think.
Right. And, she starts off the first episode solo, and then you come into it, and there's kind of that joke between you two where she tells you, oh, this is like a cross-examination, I'm going to cross-examine you.
Right.
And that's how you kind of set that dynamic. Was it something where you really consciously thought about what you wanted the audio dynamic between the two of you to be, or is that very close to what your natural rapport with each other is already?
I would say it's pretty close to our natural rapport. What we decided early on, and it was a decision that I made, well, if Trisha's going to be the host, if she's going to be the person who's going to lead me through this, let's let the audience find out who she is as a person first. Let's try to figure out if we can expose the type of person she is, the experiences she's had, how she felt about Trump at the time in the 90s, how she feels about him today, but also more importantly, her experience as a criminal defense attorney. And let the audience know this is who your host is. You can ride and die with this woman, right? And so I fought really hard to make the first episode really more about Trisha than about the case and me, because I really thought that when I would listen to a podcast, I want to know who's taking me through this story. And then when I come into it about, I would say 3/4 of the way through, then it's all about like, okay, let's tell this story. And then then for the next, 6.5 episodes, you're rock and roll. Like we're just going back and forth banter, which the way we talk when we see each other. So that was kind of the hope and desire that it would feel that way. And I think the end result feels that way.
Yeah, and I wanted to dive into the way that the two of you kind of so specifically set up that first episode. You do things like you pull in some sound bites from things that are coming up later on. You kind of tease the audience, set the stage a little bit. You bring us back into the time period of the 90s. Like you were saying, we really introduced Trisha. Then you come along and we kind of understand the context of the two of you together within this. And, I was interested in how that had like a similar trajectory in terms of the way you had to think about the narrative structure and the way that you were going to draw the audience in episode one, the same way that you would with a television pilot, because so much is riding on that first episode. It really has to hit home for people to keep hitting play and to keep listening.
Exactly. And I think, one of the things, obviously I wanted people to listen, right? I mean, this is why we create work, right? Because we want people to watch and listen. But I also wanted to make sure I was true to the idea that I'm an audience member and I'm going to listen to this. Who is Trisha LaFaccia? What's she all about? Why is she doing this? Why is she interested in this? She has a great voice. She's smart. She's a lawyer. We get that. But what makes her dig into this? We know why I'm digging in, right? Because I went through the journey, right? It was my journey. But so we worked hard on that. As for the clips and the cutouts and talking about the articles, I think we decided we would tell it linearly, right? In a way that, we'd have a beginning, middle, and end, but also that we would try to get a flavor for the time and place. New York in the early 90s was a very unique place, right? And when you're in New York now, it's, now it's a little bit different because of COVID and everything that's going on around that. But up until recently, New York turned more into like a Disneyland more than a place that was dirty and gritty and crimey. And that's the way it was in the early 90s. And so some of those, I think, clips were meant to do that, to try to draw listeners into like time and place. And the other part of it was to try to make them laugh, right? So we have, as you know, many clips from Trump back in the day, and also recent clips of Trump where he's saying some outrageous stuff, but they really, the researchers and the producers did a great job of finding those clips and then cutting them. And we had some amazing editors who were able to make it sound so good, I think. So I think it was all about trying to, if I was just telling this story a year after the events and we were sitting in a bar in New York City, that's what I wanted, the feel I wanted it to be. And that's why we went in that direction. I think we were successful. I mean, we've heard a lot of great things, a lot of great comments, and we do really well on Apple Podcasts. I mean, people just like, we're at a 4.9 and people are writing these great things, and we want more people to listen because it is a fun ride, right? It's at a time when there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in this world. It's a nice way to kick back and listen for 7 hours and be like, wow, that was a funny story. That was weird. That guy, not that I want sympathy or empathy, but I mean, I want people to be like, look, it was a pretty wild time in my life, which I expose.
Right. And there's so many details that you couldn't even make up. Like, when you're recalling one moment where one of the guy's last name is actually just calamari, and it sounds hilarious when you say it out loud. And even the concept of the case itself just sounds a little bit ludicrous on paper. Beyond those moments that just kind of automatically lent themselves with the banter that the two of you have, did you kind of think in advance, okay, these are some of the beats where we might want to pull in a little bit more of that comedy. We might want to really kind of like pause and touch upon making fun of this guy's last name and really acknowledge that and pull that in? Or did it really just...
Yeah, that's what we did. I mean, it was interesting because the story is, like, as you said, is so bizarre and so crazy. And look, truth is always stranger than fiction. And I said that from the day I came out in Hollywood. When I sit in a writer's room and I pitch a story, people are like, wait, what? I'm like, no, this really happened. I'm telling you, I could not make this up, right? I don't have that type of imagination. I just tell stories that's happened in my life. And so with this one particularly, it's not like we sat down and like, okay, let's be funny here. Let's do jokes here. Let's structure it that way. We had a very interesting process. I think what we would do is on Tuesdays, we would have a production meeting, and that would be on Zoom Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, because I was working, during this whole thing. And we would have, the producers would come in. And at that point I had written an outline of what I think the first episode should be, second episode, third episode. And I presented to them. We'd have a production meeting for about an hour. And then Trisha would take the outline and begin writing her part of it. And then the producers would be pulling clips and would be figuring out music segues and all the stuff that you hear in there. And then I would be working and then trying to think about my side of it. And then on Thursday night, Trisha would send her part of the outline to me. On Friday morning, I would get up really early and try to write my part of it. And then on Friday night, Trisha and I would talk on the phone and we'd run through it kind of. Not like, word for word, but just like, okay, you're going to say this, I'm going to say this. Around here, we should do this. And here's a cool story. And then Saturday morning, we'd go in and we'd start cold and we'd just go. And, we did it a couple times. So there would be places to edit it and cut it. And sometimes we would stumble on words. And but it was a couple hours in the studio. And then we would leave, and then the post-production team would grab it and fix it all up and make it nice and shiny, and then we would do it. But to your point, it's not like we were like, oh, like this would be like, you should tell a funny joke here. A lot of it came, just off the top of my head while we were in the studio, when all of a sudden I'd like something would click and be like, oh yeah, and then this happened. Then there would be funny things, like I say certain words funny, like underwear, I say funny, and Trisha would just start making fun of me the way I say underwear, or little things like that kind of, shows that, we have a long friendship, Trisha and I. We know each other almost 10 years, and we had that New York banter. So it kind of worked. It was a lot of work. It was more work than I thought it was, but it was fun. I had a really good time. And I was really happy to have this team of young people who were so enthusiastic, who had never, ever done it before. They had never produced a podcast, but they said, we'll figure it out. We'll learn it. And, they did. And I think it's just a success.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting hearing the way that you talk about the structure and the way that you would do it week by week. Because you didn't necessarily have to do it that way. You could have kind of like pre-prepped the entire thing and then gone in and just been recording for several days. Was that because of your schedule with your other work, or just because like you thought that it really lent itself to kind of the naturalness of how it all came together in the way that you were telling the story?
It ended up the way you just described it. I'm so happy it went down that way. I will tell you, it was not planned that way, right? So what happened was, to give you your people the behind the scenes, I had decided that I was going to sell this as a TV show, and then I would have ancillary property, a documentary and a podcast, and maybe I would sell it all to one studio, so it was a business situation. We were in negotiations with the studio. We came very close to closing a deal with the studio, and then at the last minute, as we were getting closer and closer to the election, they got silly on a couple deal points, and finally I said, you know what? You guys lost your opportunity. We have to go forward with this podcast, because in order to I thought it was very important that we get it out before the election, because the Trump stuff. And I knew that, I was hoping that the Trump stuff went the way I wanted it to go. And then I knew that there would be some sort of period of time, like right now, where stuff is happening that's dark. So like, give people something fun to listen to. So as a result of the deal falling apart with the studio, we were then staring at this very short production schedule. So it really came out of, okay, now that we have it to ourselves and we have to get it out sometime in October, I was shooting for, how are we going to do that? And then it became, okay, I'm working on a regular show. I only have mornings, nights, and weekends, and everyone kind of worked around me. And again, like, you hear it on the podcast. I mean, my producers were, Tandis Karami and Luke Groneman and Tyler Patrick Jones, young kids who just crushed it. They did all the heavy lifting. And Trisha and I would show up in the studio, and we had worked on it, getting ready, and we did some prep, but we would just have fun with it. And I think, sometimes you plan everything one way, and then you think, oh, that's going to be great, and it's not. And sometimes you plan everything one way, and then a monkey wrench gets thrown into it, and you're like, oh no, but it turns out better. And I would say that was, you have to be very flexible in the creative process, I think. And I've learned that during this period of time, definitely.
I was going to say, I feel like more often than not, a monkey wrench is thrown into everything.
Nothing ever goes according to plan, which is good, I think, because you got to be able to pivot.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of planning, because you were talking just now about how you kind of dissect and look at each of the episodes individually and where that was going on like a really granular level. But when you were sitting down at the beginning, did you know from the get-go, it's going to be this number of episodes, it's going to be roughly this sort of flow and arc? And so I wanted to kind of know how that fit in. Again, with like television writing, it's like, you have to kind of know roughly where the season's going. You don't necessarily know where the B plots are going to go. And even down to thinking about what are the important beats that you need to land. Even, okay, the end of this episode should finish with this so that people are going to jump into the next one immediately. Exactly,
the cliffhanger of it all. Yes, very, very good question, because I am a TV writer now. I used to be something else, but now I'm a TV writer. And I approached it as a TV writer, right? The first thing I did once we decided I was going to do it was by myself in a room, sat down with index cards and wrote out scenes, right? Or, little anecdotes in a linear fashion. And then I took them all and I said, okay, what are like the coolest ones, right? And then I put them at the bottom of each episode. And I said, okay, here's your act out, here's your cliffhanger. And like, okay, how can I build to those? And I took the cards that were in that episode, and it just came up to be 7. Like when you're doing a TV show, you would never pitch a network and say it's a 7-episode TV show, because they get nervous, right? They want to hear 8 or 10 or 22, but they're never like 7. It would never. But it gave me the freedom, because like it's a podcast, it can be whatever it wants, right? And I did know that we had to probably keep it as close to, not go over an hour, try to be between 45. I had done some research on that. And so by myself, I had put all of these cards together and I put them up on a cork board. And I'm like, okay, that's 7 episodes. And then I brought in my producers, I brought in Trisha, and I pitched it all. And everyone's like, yeah, that sounds great. Now that is only a very skeletal outline, right? It's like, maybe 10 to 15 cards an episode. So the real work still had to be done. But that's, to your point, I'm a TV writer. I pitch it, I pitch it to them as I would pitch a TV show. It's just the freedom of having as many episodes as I wanted. And also, like, I don't have to worry about it. It has to be 44 minutes, right? It could be between 45 and an hour. And that's kind of the way we shot it. But, exactly what you're saying is true. Because I'd never done a podcast, and I don't know how any other podcasters do it, I know how to do TV. So I did it as a TV show, and it worked. Yeah. I still have the cards. They're like over there.
Oh, amazing. And I believe that it was a conscious decision to not look at or pursue any sort of advertising that would pop up throughout the episodes as well. And wanted to ask why that was such an important choice from your perspective in the way that you wanted to tell the story and have it just flow for the audience.
Yeah, look, I understand why people have ads on their podcasts. I understand people have to make money. I support that. I came at this in a different way. I created this content in order to sell it as a TV show. The financials will come once that happens. If it happens, it's a gamble. But look, I'm betting on myself. I'm betting on our team. I'm betting on this podcast. And I also, I thought in a TV show, in a podcast where you're basically wanting to stool up with the two people and have a drink with them as they banter back and forth. You don't want to be like, yeah, coming right back at monkey wrench or monkey quip or whatever it was. I don't know. To me, it would have taken them out of it, and I wanted them to be there with me the entire time. And so we decided, we didn't. To be honest with you, we didn't even research to see how much money we could make with commercials or ads. I was just like, look, I don't want to get into that. And my team, all worked on a volunteer basis with the understanding that we all own a piece of the IP, and they're taking the gamble too. So, to make a little money here and there, to potentially, have the quality of it, I think it would have suffered, because it's not your typical podcast. It is, hey, come sit with Trisha and Kevin and listen to this story. And, sitting around the fire, sitting at the bar, sitting in a coffee shop, whatever it is, I wanted to feel that way. And I felt like if we went out and did an ad or two in there, it would have messed with the flow. And so we made a decision. And it was a business decision. And we'll see. It pays off, it doesn't pay off. That's what gambling's all about. We'll see. I think it will.
What our whole industry is founded on, is taking better.
Yes.
One of the other aspects of the storytelling that I was interested in asking you a little bit about was the use of language, and specifically when you determine that you want to break something down and explain it or give more context to the audience. You have a high respect for the audience and for the listeners in this, and it's never dumbing it down, and it's never pausing at a moment where it doesn't feel relevant. And a lot of the times, it adds to the humor as well. Even there's the moment where there's that famous phrase, in New York, it's so easy to indict someone, you could indict a ham sandwich, and then you throw in a bunch of sound bites. Yeah. And it helps to contextualize the moment from a legal standpoint, but also, it adds to the brevity of the moment and the way that you're telling the story. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the way that you thought specifically about legal language in how you're explaining it, and when you wanted to do those breakdown moments to really kind of contextualize it for us.
That's a great question. I'd love to talk to you about that, because we are two lawyers, right? Trisha and I are lawyers. And when we talk our own language, and nobody can understand, and we have to be very careful of that. And we had, like I said, we had these young producers who would have signs, right? And they would hold up the signs. The signs used to read stuff like, put me in the room. Like when they wanted me to be more descriptive. You describe that better, or too much legal, explain the legal. So there were times when we would understand, Trisha and I, oh, wow, what we're talking about, we understand, but the audience is probably not going to understand. we also didn't want to dumb it down. So we tried to figure out ways. Either we did clips, or Trisha would sometimes explain the legal concept in a way that was easy. Or sometimes we tried to get some humor around it too. But it was really our producers being in the room with us while we recorded, which was really helpful, because after a take, like, that was great, but we have no idea what you're talking about. Like, what does that mean? And so then we're like, oh, okay, we have to explain that a little bit better. So I would say part of it was certainly in the writing of it, thinking, okay, is the audience going to understand that? But actually having a live audience there allowed us to really have them, and we empowered them, right? We said to them, you guys need to stop us and tell us if we're doing too much of the legalese stuff. And I think it works. I think that a lot of non-lawyers have commented that they feel like they're behind the scenes of the criminal justice system, and that's what we really wanted to do. I spent 15 years in that system, and even when I tell stories now, and people are like, "Really? That's the way it happens?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's not like Law and Order. Like, it's very different." And there are ways to, I think, to pull back the curtain and teach people what the system's really like, especially now, right? There's a lot going on with the system now that, unfortunately, there's a lot of bad light shown upon it. And so I always think that sunlight is the best antiseptic. Like, let's talk about it. I've got a lot of experience in it. I can talk all day about it, and I can, tell people about it. But I think that, to your point, it comes down to not dumbing it down, but also, keeping it interesting, but also understandable, because you don't want to go over people's heads.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting the way that you do character development within a podcast. It's not the same as a script where you see person on screen and you're writing dialogue for them and we're seeing them in action, but you do such a good job at really setting like a visual scope of who some of these people are. There's the moment of like, he talks a little bit like Joe Pesci, like we immediately know what that guy's voice is, even though we haven't heard it. And was that something that was kind of consciously playing at the back of your mind as you were describing all of the characters that come into the story as well?
Yes, I think, obviously I had told the story a number of times in my life. And what was interesting about telling the story to these young producers was their desire to see the people. So they went on the internet and they tried to look at pictures, and there's not a lot. And then it was like, well, what do you look like? And so I described it. And then I would, I tend to be, try to describe people, places, and things in a way that people are going to remember. That's from being a trial lawyer, right? When you're a trial lawyer and you're presenting to a jury, you have to paint a picture. You have to paint the picture so the jury, when they're in that jury room, can say, oh yeah, I remember him saying this and he said it like that. So you do little things in your descriptions to really, hook the jurors. And so I have that, I've been trained that way. And when the producers would be like, paint a picture, put us in the room, let us know what it's like. Then I realized, oh, what I'm really doing here is I'm painting a picture for the audience so they can feel like, oh yeah, I know what that guy, he looks like Joe Pesci, he talks like Joe Pesci. I know what that guy looks like, right? Matt Calamari with his sausage fingers, right? He was as big as a linebacker. Like those types of descriptive words, I think allows, listeners who are driving in their car to actually see the movie as they listen. And it's a radio play, right? I mean, we used to do radio plays back a long time ago. It's the same thing. It's how can you do it in a way that's fun, entertaining, but also puts people's imaginations into the, play with their imaginations, give them descriptive words, tell them descriptive things, tell them how you felt. I think one of the things about this podcast is it allowed me to say stuff that I had not really told in the stories before. It's like, because people were like, how did you feel? How did you feel when that happened? And I was like, it wasn't great, right? I didn't feel great. I thought I was losing my job. I thought it was stupid. I felt really free to basically just tell the truth the way I remember it. And that was fun.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of all the unique aspects and challenges that came with creating a podcast series for the first time, are there things that you feel like you've developed as part of your skill set that even as you go further into working on more television shows is really going to kind of like sit with you and come into play in the work that you do down the line? Yes,
that 100%. I learned a lot from this process. I feel like I could do another podcast, and we're playing with the idea of maybe doing another one. I also think in a writer's room, when you have to tell these stories, realizing that this experience has taught me that when I tell a story, to make sure everyone in the room is understanding the story, not just people who may know a little bit about crime or a little bit about the criminal justice system, but even someone who's never experienced. Because I'm in writers' rooms a lot of times with people who've never been in a courtroom, who've never been in a police precinct, who've never met a cop. So while it's easy for me to tell those stories about people who do have some experience with that, the telling of the story in the podcast, when I was realizing, when the producers would be like, I don't know what you're talking about, understanding that, oh, a lot of times when I speak, people may not know what I'm talking about because they don't understand my experience. I talk fast, I have an accent. So, being able to be a better storyteller, I think, I hope that I am a better storyteller as a result of this process, because I did learn certain things. And, look, nobody likes the sound of their voice. It was hard for me to listen to myself in it, but I forced myself, and I did, pick up certain things, which are, sometimes speak slower, sometimes speak more clear, use more descriptive words. These are all things that I can use in my job as a storyteller in a writer's room. And I think I'm better at it. I mean, I feel I'm better at it because of it. So I was happy that that was kind of a little gift at the end of it that I didn't think about at all.
That's so fantastic, and I love that you mentioned earlier that there's a possibility of more shows coming out of your experience as a prosecutor, and more stories that you might be telling in this way. It's such a fantastic series, and I hope that everybody checks it out on iTunes and all of the different spaces where great podcasts are available. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Oh, thank you. This was a lot of fun, and I mean, whatever. I would love to do this again with you guys another time. Maybe talk about TV stuff.